Doctor, I think you had been talking about the temple matter, and could I ask you if that at that point, if you had, as you discussed that, if you had any considerations considering whether or not the defendant was psychotic?
Well, I gave consideration to that, not only with respect to the temple, but with respect to all of the evidence. And I found no evidence that Mr. Dahmer has ever had any psychotic symptom. There are three kinds of psychotic symptoms that do occur from time to time in individuals if they have a psychotic illness. One is hallucinations, which is the experience of perceiving something present which is not present, nor is this merely a mistake. Most often hearing a voice speaking to someone or seeing a vision that is not there. The voice is not there, but it's perceived as being there, or the vision is not there, but is perceived as being there. Mr. Dahmer has never told anyone that he's ever had a hallucination at any time. A second kind of psychotic symptom is known as a delusion, and a delusion is a false belief that is firmly held, the product of a mental illness, and can't be challenged with any kind of evidence. A patient who actually has a delusion has a firmly held belief, and no matter what evidence is brought before them, it will not change their view of what happened. Now, there are other stubborn people who have a wrong opinion that they can't be talked out of, but it's only a delusion if it's a belief that arises from a mental illness. And Mr. Dahmer, in my opinion, has never had any delusional belief at any time in his life. The third kind of psychotic symptom is that of markedly disordered thinking, and this refers to a derangement in the way in which the mind works, such that the patient is unable to think logically. And usually that is obvious to those around the patient because they can't communicate logically or coherently. If they do any writing, it doesn't make sense. And anyone who tries to follow their logic can see that there's something wrong with the thinking of the individual. Though there are various ways in which that may manifest itself, it's not difficult to see. And there's no indication that Mr. Dahmer has ever had markedly illogical thinking, with the form of his thoughts being strange. What has been strange is the content of his thoughts, because his sexual interests are indeed abnormal, or at least some of them are. And that's different from having the form of one's thinking be impaired. He's able to reason logically. He's able to communicate without difficulty, and there's no impairment, as far as I've been able to tell, at any time in Mr. Dahmer's capacity for logical thinking. Part of my examination was what's called a mental status examination, in which I asked him a series of questions to see how his mind was working at that time. And I also took a history of what symptoms he may or may not have experienced in the past. And in the course of that mental status examination and all of the other evidence I reviewed, I found no evidence that Mr. Dahmer ever had any psychotic symptom. The one feature of his behavior that I needed to explore most carefully, however, was that related to these ideas concerning the temple. And I concluded, after analyzing all the evidence available, that what those ideas about the temple ought best to be considered, excuse me, assuming that they're true, they ought to be considered to be an example of superstitious beliefs. And superstitious beliefs can occur both among those who do not have any of the psychiatrically recognized mental disorders, and can also occur among people who do. There's one particular personality disorder in which superstitious beliefs are a common feature. And I would think in Mr. Dahmer's case that the best way to describe those superstitious beliefs in relation to the temple or the horror films he was watching would be to see them as the kind of superstitious beliefs one sees in that personality disorder known as schizotypal personality disorder. I don't think he has that disorder because he doesn't have enough of the features of it, but he has that particular trait, and he also has the trait of not having friends during his adult life, which occurs in that same cluster of features. And so that kind of superstitious belief is very much like people who dabble with the occult in other ways and believe in clairvoyance, or who are interested in reading New Age books, or think that crystals might contain some information, or go to palmists. And just because one has beliefs of that sort doesn't mean that one has any more serious problem.
Doctor, as part of the information I forwarded to you, I forwarded the copies of the Wisconsin jury instructions on the issue of mental responsibility. Is that correct?
Yes, you did.
And those materials contain a definition of the words mental disease. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in considering the various paraphilias and determining whether, in your opinion, they were a mental disease, did you consider the Wisconsin jury instruction?
Yes, I did.
Would you explain to the jury what your perceptions are on that issue?
Well, first of all, mental disease is not a current medical or psychiatric term. And so what I addressed and believed it was my task to do was what Wisconsin law means by mental disease. And there's a specific definition in the jury instructions you sent me, according to which mental disease is an abnormal condition of the mind that substantially affects mental or emotional processes. And so I considered whether the paraphilic disorders of Mr. Dahmer are an abnormal condition of the mind that substantially affects mental or emotional processes. And in my opinion, the paraphilic conditions of Mr. Dahmer, or for that matter of anyone with a paraphilia, do not substantially affect mental or emotional processes. What the paraphilias do affect are sexual interests. But mental processes, such as the capacity to reason, the ability to use logic, the ability to think clearly and communicate, those mental processes, and indeed all mental processes, are untouched by the paraphilias. Individuals can have any of the paraphilias, including the most bizarre of them, and yet be thoroughly intelligent, logical, rational, high-functioning people. And indeed, Mr. Dahmer is of above-average intelligence and has intact all of the mental processes. As to whether the paraphilic conditions affect his emotional processes, here again, I think the answer is no. The paraphilias affect his sexual interests. They affect what will give him an erection, but they have no impact on his emotional regulation, that is, his emotional processes. Individuals with paraphilia do not necessarily have any other problems, and in particular, there is no relationship between having a paraphilia and having problems with one's emotional processes, such as depression or anxiety or euphoria. We recognize in psychiatry various kinds of emotional processes that can be impaired in patients, but the paraphilias don't cause those impairments, such as disorders of mood or of anxiety. So I don't believe that Mr. Dahmer's paraphilic conditions substantially affect his mental or emotional processes.
And therefore would not be a mental disease under the Wisconsin law, in your opinion? Would it be accurate?
Well, of course, it's a jury question, but if that's what a mental disease is, then I don't believe that a paraphilia is such a condition.
In your diagnosis of Mr. Dahmer, you identified certain personality traits that are found commonly in the antisocial personality. Would you comment on that to the jury?
Well, I found some traits for several different of the kinds of personality patterns, including antisocial. And the particular traits that occur in antisocial personalities that occur in Mr. Dahmer are first a failure to conform to social norms. In other words, he breaks the law, and he's done so both in the charged killings and in some other matters that have come to the attention of the authorities in the past. Secondly, that he has never sustained a monogamous relationship for more than a year. He has had periods of celibacy, and he's had periods of promiscuity, and he's had periods with multiple partners, but he's never had a monogamous relationship for a year. Thirdly, Mr. Dahmer has had an excessive number of absences from work, both at the plasma center and also at the chocolate factory. In fact, that's what led to his losing each of those jobs, and excessive absenteeism from work that's unexplained by illness in oneself or one's family is one of the features that occurs among antisocial personalities. And fourthly, Mr. Dahmer has a history of disregarding the truth by lying to other people and conning others for his personal pleasure, principally with respect to the crimes with which he's charged, where it was necessary to con people into returning to the apartment under various pretexts, and where he found himself telling a number of lies to cover his tracks in the course of these crimes. So those four features are sufficient to fulfill the adulthood criteria in antisocial personality disorder diagnosis. But Mr. Dahmer does not, so far as I can tell, have the childhood features of that disorder. And so I do not believe a diagnosis of such a disorder is correct, but merely am pointing out that he has some of the adult features.
And it's true to say, is it not, that within the field of psychiatry, for the most part, there's a substantial agreement that the antisocial personality disorder is not a mental disease? Would that be accurate?
Well, psychiatry doesn't use the concept of mental disease, but I don't think anyone in psychiatry thinks it's a mental illness.
In terms of the discussion we had yesterday about the control of fantasies and how they're created, I'm not sure that was entirely clear to me, perhaps. Would you discuss that, the issue of control and fantasies?
Well, Mr. Dahmer had, I believe, the onset of his paraphilias while still an adolescent. And what I hope I conveyed yesterday is that I don't think that any adolescent is in control of what paraphilias he acquires, or at least not intentionally in control of that. Paraphilias are acquired by a combination of circumstances in life, I think, and that it is a matter of what he learns to find sexy. And as he goes through life, he discovers what it is that is sexy to him. That is what I mean by the acquisition of a paraphilia. It is learning to find certain things in life sexy. And he didn't choose which things he would find sexy. What someone with a paraphilia does choose and control, however, is what then happens based on what he finds sexy. Like anyone else, when his desire for sex surfaces, he will be inclined to think about or seek out those kinds of things that are to him sexy. Now, as to what he thinks about, thoughts can enter an individual's mind uninvited. He can voluntarily invoke fantasies of his favorite paraphilic images. He can voluntarily invoke fantasies of attractive young males with the desired physique without any of the paraphilic fantasies becoming part of it. And he's done both those things. He can also attempt to suppress those or any other sexual fantasies. And there have been times when he has voluntarily suppressed his sexual fantasies. But it's also true that thoughts can creep into one's mind without being invited. They can come in a dream. They can enter one's mind while one's trying to think about something else. And that happens to everyone from time to time, that thoughts come into their mind that they weren't inviting in. And so some of what thoughts cross his mind is not under voluntary control, though he can suppress it, think about something else in the same way that anyone else can try to push thoughts out of their mind or invite them in. And as to actions, the paraphilias have no effect on one's capacity to choose whether to act or not. And so his capacity to decide whether to commit a crime to fulfill his sexual desire, as opposed to masturbating while thinking about such a crime, is as much a matter of his choice as it is for any individual who makes a decision whether to satisfy sexual urges in some lawful way, including masturbation, or in some illegal way. So what I meant to be conveying is that he didn't control what paraphilias he got and what he found sexy. He has, as anyone does, a great deal of control over what fantasies he allows in his mind or invites in. And he has just as much control as any normal person as to whether he acts to gratify himself sexually and what acts those will be.
Thank you very much. Doctor, in connection with the deaths of Oliver Lacey and Joseph Bredehoff, you talked about an altering role of alcohol. And just so that the issue is clear, I'd like to put this question to you with respect to both deaths. Did you form an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether the defendant's paraphilic involvement alone rendered him without substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law or to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct?
I did.
And that's with respect to both defendants. And what was your opinion as the question is put in that fashion?
My opinion is that the paraphilic involvement and interests of Mr. Dahmer did not substantially impair his capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law at the times of those or any of the other homicides.
Right. And is that to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes, it is.
Right. Can you tell the jury why Mr. Dahmer had these parts of human beings around at the house at the time of the arrest?
Well, at the time of the arrest, there were three reasons for the particular parts that he had there. One reason was that some of the remains of Mr. Turner were frozen to the bottom of the freezer, and it was a practical problem to thaw the freezer and discard them. A second reason for having some of the remains was that he hadn't yet gotten round to discarding things that he had planned to discard. He had put some things in the freezer and some in the refrigerator that he meant to further process and to discard. But a third reason is that there were materials that he intended to keep and would have liked to have kept. And it's that third point that accounts for the skulls that he had already processed by boiling and removing soft tissues, and in some instances applying lacquer and this granite-looking paint. And it also accounts for the complete skeleton of Ernest Miller that he had already preserved. And he intended, he told me, to keep also the complete skeleton of one of the other victims in order to be able to at some point reconstruct it.
These in the nature, I'm sorry.
Namely, Mr. Lacey. what Mr. Dahmer has repeatedly said was that he wanted to keep skulls and at least some of those parts because they reminded him of the victims. He felt that their lives and deaths had not been such a complete waste if he could retain parts of them. They served as remembrances and keepsakes for him. He would occasionally use some of those, at least the ones associated with the men he found more attractive, as a stimulus to masturbation fantasies in which he'd think about the man and the things he'd done with the man. And so he kept them both as mementos and as a stimulus for masturbation so that he could continue to enjoy them sexually.
How could a person spend the hours that he did cutting up bodies?
Well, Mr. Dahmer indicated he found that activity repulsive originally, and that with time and with repetition, eventually it became a less onerous task, though the odor continued to bother him, and it always seemed like a great deal of work to him. He said that he would use alcohol to decrease the repulsiveness of that, and he described other techniques he used to make it less unappealing, but he described a process that we would refer to as desensitization, in which with repeated exposure to this, it became less and less troublesome to do it. And of course, that's a process through which many people go in the course of doing work that brings them in contact with such unspeakable things. People who work around ambulance services or emergency rooms, operating rooms, mortuaries, morgues, battlefields, identifying victims in forensic labs. All of those kinds of activities cause the professionals who do those things to have to develop a thicker skin and to get less upset about it. And they use various coping mechanisms to achieve that so that they're not so upset, and they have to learn not to relate emotionally to every one of these victims they deal with, or it's overwhelming. And just as professionals become desensitized to doing autopsies and handling human remains, Mr. Dahmer substantially desensitized himself to much of that.
And I'd like to keep in mind, in responding to this question, to keep in mind your personal experiences in serial slayings. I'd like you to keep in mind the cases that you've reviewed, worked on with respect to the behavioral science unit counseling you've had with the FBI, and to keep in mind the serial type cases that you've researched in preparing and writing articles about serial killers. Keeping all that in mind, do you have a comment as to whether or not this case is particularly unique, this Dahmer case?
Well, of course, every case is unique because every individual is unique and has personal motivations and personal histories that make them a human. But the more bizarre elements in Mr. Dahmer's case are all things that have occurred before. And none are really inventions of his for committing crimes in these ways or doing these things. There's a long historical precedent for many of the behaviors he engaged in. One of the earliest of the described serial killers was a man in what was then Transylvania, who in fact would keep the bodies of his male victims and have their heads mounted for a beauty contest from time to time. He would have his servants, because he was a wealthy man, arrange the heads.
Excuse me, can we get a year on this? When was this? What year?
I'm afraid I can't recall the year, but I believe it was in the 16th century. I'm not sure of that.
And I'm going to object to it unless there's some foundation. The doctor had something, some knowledge other than reading books about it. So therefore, I think it's immaterial and irrelevant.
I'll ask you to update. Appreciate your historical, the depth of which you studied this subject, that you have the historical perception, but would you bring it, update it in terms of what you've seen in the years you've worked with the FBI, your reading in recent years, and your own involvement in serial killers?
jumping ahead several centuries, then
Yes.
we could come to the case of Harvey Glattman, who, like Mr. Dahmer, used the pretext of wanting to take bondage photographs in order to get victims in a helpless position, and who, after taking their photographs, would then strangle them.
Judge, with all due respect to the good doctor, I'm going to object to this. Unless there's a foundation that we're going to be comparing serial killings, what one person did with another, and whether the psychosis or not. Object to it, it's beyond the scope of the proper inquiry before this jury.
If it please the court, Mr. Boyle has attempted to adduce from several witnesses successfully to an extent, at least within their knowledge. This case seemed quite unique. This is not an issue otherwise I would be raising. It was an issue moved by Mr. Boyle, dwelt on by Mr. Boyle.
But the court has a broad discretion to place some limits as to what's going to be helpful to the jury. How long are we going to take on this historical view?
3 minutes, Doctor. Can we make it 3 or 4 minutes?
Any deadline you like.
Okay, fine. In your own
Objection is overruled. You may proceed.
Dismemberment as a form of ridding oneself of remains is also something that occurs in a number of cases, not just among serial killers, but among ordinary, rather single victim killers as well. A case that I consulted on last year involved a man who had killed his own mentally ill daughter, perhaps in self-defense, after years of abuse by her, and who, having done so, wished to avoid being found with the body because he thought the police would not believe the self-defense story. And he dismembered his own daughter in the bathtub. Eventually was persuaded by his sister to call the police. And when the police arrived, they found the daughter's head in the refrigerator, her heart in the refrigerator, parts of her body boiling in pots on the stove, her arm sticking out of the sink drain, and blood throughout the bathtub. All of which, for him, a man with no history of mental illness and who was doing very well at work, and in fact even went to work for the day in the midst of this, was a means of trying to remove the evidence of the killing. A second dismemberment case that I consulted on was one who dismembered the body simply to be able to fit it into a trunk so that it could be more readily concealed. And dismemberment's used for a variety of means, in a variety of ways, in order to dispose of evidence among offenders who have even killed just one. The desire to have sex slaves, such as the zombies that Mr. Dahmer describes wanting to create, is quite common among serial killers and is one of the more prominent features of some of them who go to great lengths to do it, including constructing special cells or captivity rooms in their dwellings or special bunkers in which to keep the victims so that they can keep a victim alive and available to them sexually for as long as possible. And a number have, in fact, confined victims for long periods of time, even as long as years. And necrophilia is also not a unique feature of this case. The last serial killer trial that I testified in involved a man who, in fact, was motivated by necrophilia to kill his various victims. He was convicted of killing 10 or 11 prostitutes and had left one go free who gave the account that he had difficulty becoming erect until he directed her to pretend she was dead, close her eyes, and lie still, whereupon he was able to perform sexually. And he was so gratified by her willingness to do that that he let her live. And this man reported returning to the scene of some of the crimes to lie next to the bodies and to just lay down beside them and go to sleep with them. And on one occasion went to sleep with a corpse in his car with him. So each element of the case that would seem to be bizarre is one that's occurred in other homicides and that is in fact not unique.
Were those individuals found sane?
Yeah, I'm going to object to the former question. It's inappropriate, irrelevant.
Nothing further, Doctor. Thank you.
I'd like to start now. Dr. Dietz, have you ever testified in a case of responsibility where the primary dysfunctioning of the defendant was paraphilia without more, where you opined that the paraphilia in that human being was a mental disease?
I can't imagine doing that, no.
Is it safe to say that you would always hold fast to the premise that a person who suffers from a paraphilia without more in the way of psychiatric disturbance would never rise to the level where you could opine a mental disease?
Well, that would depend on what definition of mental disease one had to operate with.
Take Wisconsin. Mental disease in the instruction is further delineated by a statement that it is it's an impairment of the mind, whether enduring or transitory, that affects the mental or emotional processes of the accused. Okay? If you ever find a paraphilia in any human being to be such that it would be considered an impairment of the mind, whether enduring or transitory, that would affect the emotional or mental processes of the suspect?
I don't think that I would ever find that a paraphilia alone impaired mental or emotional processes.
Dr. Dietz, for the purposes of this discussion, I have the highest respect for you, and I do not in any way mean to demean your professionalism, okay? I have seen you testify in California versus Broderick, and I know of some of the other cases you've been involved in. But I have to ask you a number of questions. If I were a defense lawyer, as I am, and I concluded that I had a client that was suffering from a paraphilia, you would not be the fella I'd want to call to come in with an eye towards finding mental disease if I was convinced that the only thing that I, in my layperson's opinion, could find was a paraphilia, correct?
Given the mental disease definition that we're talking about, that's right.
Sure. As a matter of fact, as early as 1985, in the annuals of the American Association of Psychiatric, the annuals of the American Academy of Psychiatric Experts, in an article in January of 1985, you wrote Why Experts Disagree, Variations in Psychiatric Evaluations of Criminal Insanity. You remember that?
That's an article in the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science.
Okay, and you wrote that.
I wrote an article in that, yes.
And do you recall saying in opinion, you were discussing opinion formation of the forensic psychiatrist, you say certain mental disorders such as mental retardation, schizophrenia, or dementia can have such severe effects on functioning, while others, such as sexual deviation, anxiety disorders, and most personality disorders cannot. Remember making that statement?
Yes, that's right.
And you hold true to that today.
Yes, I do.
Okay, and in a footnote, you said, in the footnote to that paragraph, you said it is possible to concoct improbable factual situations in which these latter disorders, which would include sexual deviations, latter disorders would form the basis of a legitimate insanity defense, I have never seen such a case and am unconvinced by the cases my psychiatric colleagues offer as examples. That's what you said.
It is. And in fact, I was thinking of Dr. Berlin as the one who offers examples.
Yeah,
That's
good.
That's right.
But you hold true to that today.
Yes.
You have never seen a paraphilic case standing alone with that as the primary diagnosis or the diagnosis where the conduct of that paraphilic could ever be such that his conduct, his problem would be considered an impairment of the mind, transitory or enduring, that could in any way affect his emotional or mental processes so that he would be found not responsible for the conduct that he engaged in. True?
Well, there's a lot in that question.
Sure.
I don't believe that that's what the law says, that it could in any way affect his mental or emotional processes. I think it asks for more. But it is true that I've never seen a case in which an individual who suffered from only a paraphilia and no other disorders could qualify for an insanity defense under any of the current tests of insanity. Although I have seen people who had a paraphilia and also a mental illness who were insane because of their mental illness.
What would mental illness? What kind? Schizophrenia?
The medically, what I recognize as the mental illnesses are schizophrenia,
Sure.
dementia,
Sure.
delirium, delusional disorder,
Sure.
which used to be called paranoia, and at least some instances of manic depressive disorder.
But the fact of the matter is, all psychiatrists, similarly situated with who are considered to be good psychiatrists, would agree with that definition of mental illness, right? There aren't people who are saying schizophrenia isn't a mental illness, are there?
Right. I think everyone would agree those are all mental illnesses.
All right. So what we have then is we have a person like yourself that says that if you're paraphilic, or you've got personality disorders, or you've got post-traumatic syndrome, but you also have schizophrenia, delusional thinking, paranoia, dementia, then you may be mentally ill. And when you do something, you may have an insanity defense.
No, if you have a mental illness, you are mentally ill. There's no may about it. If you're schizophrenic, you're mentally ill. But the other part is true, that if someone has a mental illness as well as a paraphilia or personality disorder, et cetera, then they may be insane for crimes.
Now, let's talk about the schizophrenic. Not everything the schizophrenic does in the course of his daily life is a product of his mental illness, is it?
That's right.
So that schizophrenics can take a gun and shoot someone and still be held accountable for the shooting unless you can connect the act with their schizophrenia, correct?
Well, unless you can connect their schizophrenia with the functions the law requires for finding of insanity.
Not all schizophrenics who murder are insane at the time of the commission of the offense, correct?
Correct.
Not all schizophrenics who act are unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct, correct?
Correct.
Not all schizophrenics who act are unable or lack substantial capacity to conform their conduct to requirements of law, correct?
Yes.
Not all paraphilics are able to appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct. True?
Unless there's something that would cause them not to appreciate the wrongfulness.
I understand that. Let's leave out all other mental illnesses. Persons suffering from paralytic disorders alone are always able to appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct.
I believe you meant paraphilic disorder.
Paraphilic, I'm sorry.
If an individual only has a paraphilia and no other impairment of the mind, then they would appreciate the wrongfulness of any wrongful acts they commit.
No paraphilic, unless he has an attending mental disorder such as the ones you listed, schizophrenia, dementia, delusional thinking. No paraphilic could, because of his paraphilia, lack substantial capacity to conform his conduct to requirements of law. True?
I believe that's true.
Okay. So what you've told us then
very, very well, incidentally, very impressive. But you've told us yesterday and in today was because all I found was paraphilia, I conclude absolutely, absolutely, that this man was at all times able to conform his conduct to requirements of law.
Not exactly. Paraphilia wasn't all I found.
Well, the only I'm sorry, go ahead.
And it is a relevant inquiry for the jury and for me as to whether the other problems of Mr. Dahmer could relieve him of responsibility. And as I testified, I think that there is a possibility that alcohol intoxication that was other than purposely to lower his inhibitions played a substantial part in the last 2 killings with which he's charged here.
But let's take the first 13 then, just the 13. You were present at a panel discussion with Dr. Rossman, Dr. Resnick. I remember the other gentleman. You remember who the other one was?
No, I don't.
Where the subject matter, I think the third one was Dr. Hucker. Remember that one? That was
Yes.
a panel discussion that took place sometime in December of '87, reported in the AAPL newsletter. What's AAPL stand for?
That's the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law.
And this was an annual meeting summary about what went on during this panel discussion. You were one of the panelists of the 3, and the chair was Dr. Philip Resnick. Do you remember being there?
I remember being there. I don't remember whether I was a panelist or what. What was the date of it?
Well, let me show you what I have, and then maybe you can help me.
Thank you.
I think you're on the second page. There's a summary of a whole bunch of different things going on at the same time, I think. You're up the top right-hand corner, I think.
I see.
Yeah. Remember that?
I remember being there and being a panelist.
Actually, that subject matter that you may have that. I'll give it right back to you. If you need a copy, I'll get it. You remember that you discussed necrophilia, and you discussed the definition and the classification of necrophilia, and you said that true necrophilia, or at least it's reported, according to the DSM-3R, would be present in 2 forms, ego dystonic fantasy and necrophilic offenders. You remember saying that?
No, but I recall what I've always said on that subject, that someone might have recorded that way.
Before we go on any further, do you like or dislike the DSM-3R? Do you use it?
I use it all the time, and there's a great deal of it I like, and there are things I think are quite wrong about it.
As a matter of fact, you were on 2 of the panel, or 2 of the committees, one on paraphilias, and then you also were on impulse control disorders not otherwise classified.
Yes.
Okay, now, I'm going to be asking about that, so I'll put it up here so we can get close. I want to ask you, however, about your feelings on necrophilia that you talked about at that annual meeting, and at least the presenter of this saying what you all were saying said that you said that necrophilia would be in 2 forms, ego dystonic fantasy and necrophilic offenders. What is ego dystonic fantasy?
Well, this isn't a phrase that I would have endorsed, but I know what that refers to.
Okay, would you tell us?
Sure. What I would have been addressing was that the DSM-3R committee got into a disagreement. In fact, it's one I already mentioned to the jury, in which everyone else on the committee, including Dr. Berlin and Dr. Becker, voted that we shouldn't call an individual paraphilic if it doesn't bother them to have these unusual desires. And I thought we should call them paraphilic even if they're happy to want to do these things.
Okay.
And so I was saying that the way the committee was going, I don't know if the book was out at the time yet or not, but that what had happened was that the rest of the committee had said there are two ways to earn the diagnosis. You can either be a criminal and act on necrophilia, or you can be a non-criminal
Sure.
who wants to do things with corpses and doesn't like the wish and doesn't do it, which would be someone who has ego-dystonic paraphilic fantasies.
Okay.
That is, doesn't like having these fantasies.
Your view was also that the concept of necrophilia include all those who have necrophilic fantasies. That's basically what you wanted. And
I would like to use the term for anyone who has the persistent desire to do this, whether it bothers them or not.
Okay. Then you said the classifications, however, of necrophiles would then be made according to the degree that the fantasies are carried over into action. That would be how you would separate the one type of necrophile from another type of necrophile. That's what you were proposing.
I don't recall, though I've always thought it made sense to look at what adaptations the paraphile would use.
It is reported that what you were saying on the panel was that the acts occur over a spectrum ranging from role-playing with sexual partners, pure violation of a corpse, through crimes of accessing corpses and homicide. Do you remember making that statement?
I don't remember the one after role-playing.
I'm sorry. After role-playing with sexual partners, pure violation of a corpse through crimes of accessing corpses and homicide.
I don't know what pure violation of a corpse is, but the rest of that I remember.
Okay, well, and just so, see, I'm only going on the basis of what I'm reading that they said you said. So if you want to just read that, maybe we can hustle this along a little bit.
Yes, I understand what that's about.
I think, if I may interpret your words, what you're saying is that anybody who thinks about necrophilic behavior, whether you're bothered by it or not, the mere fact that you got it, all those people should be put into the necrophile category. And then what we'll do from there is we'll find out just how distressed they are from it and start classifying them depending upon what they do with it. The person who just has the thoughts, or to the person who uses his spouse in a role playing, or the person who actually goes and gets a corpse, or to the person who kills to get that fantasy done. Isn't that what you were saying?
No, not at all. First of all, I don't think everybody who just thinks about it should have this label. I mean, to have the label, one has to have sexual urges toward sex with a corpse persisting for at least 6 months. That's not just thinking about it, that's wanting to do it.
Okay.
But I did maintain that everybody who wants to do it persistently for 6 months has this abnormality we call necrophilia. And then I suggested that one can look at those who don't act on it at all, those who will molest a corpse, those who will dig up a grave or rob a mortuary to get a corpse, and those who will even kill to have a fresh corpse. But I don't see that as a spectrum of how distressed they are. I see it as a spectrum of how bad they are, how willing they are to commit crimes to.
Sure. So you recognize at that time when you were talking about necrophiles, that there were necrophiles whose fantasies were so strong that they'd go out and kill to fulfill those fantasies.
I didn't think it then, and I don't think it now. I don't think anyone kills because their fantasies are strong. I think they kill because their inhibitions against killing are lowered and they indulge themselves.
You then talk about pseudo-necrophilia. What is your position and what does the word pseudo-necrophilia mean to you?
I was responding to a classification that Dr. Resnick developed, and I no longer recall what the classification was.
Wasn't that a classification of a person who involves himself in necrophilia as an afterthought? In other words, they kill, and then after they kill, they say, I want to try and have sex with. Isn't that pseudo-necrophilia?
I don't recall what was meant by it at the time of that meeting, but I think that would be something one could reasonably call pseudo-necrophilia.
At that same conference at which you were present as a panelist, and I assume that you stayed for the panel discussion and while other panelists made their thoughts, Dr. Resnick, I trust in your presence, and if not, tell me, said, with regard to social policy, psychiatrists are always perceived as excusing sin and considering paraphilias as a basis for insanity, and considering paraphilias as a basis for insanity would undermine their remaining credibility. Paraphilias could be considered in the sentencing phase of a trial rather than the guilt-innocence phase. Do you recall that being made in your presence?
Not specifically, but I accept that it was.
Okay. You know Dr. Resnick to have been a expert in the field of necrophilia, do you know?
Yes.
He's done a lot of studies on it.
I don't know about a lot, but he has studied the subject very carefully.
Have you ever read the study that he and the other gentleman who was on that panel,
Dr. Rossman.
Dr. Rossman did?
I believe that I have.
Okay, I want to show it to you if I may. See if, not that, we got it, just to ask you if you're in agreement. Did you ever read this, I'm not going to get marked yet, this, you read that?
I read some version of this. I don't recall if it was a draft or whether I reviewed it for the journal for them to decide whether to publish it. But at some stage, I've read.
Good. May I have it back? I want to ask you some questions. There's some discussions about alcohol used by necrophiles in here, and I want to ask you if you agree or disagree with at least what is stated here. And that is, the use of alcohol or drugs may have been an important factor in helping some of the perpetrators overcome their inhibitions and actually perform their necrophilic acts. Brill, whoever he is quoted as saying, quote, the destruction of the dams of shame, disgust, and morality which take place in the erection of necrophilia requires more psychic labor than in the construction of any other perversions. Do you agree with that?
That might be so. I don't know. I mean,
This is alcohol may have been used in some cases to overcome inhibitions about killing rather than about the necrophilic acts. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that, yes.
Do you agree with this? Although the most common motive of necrophilia was the possession of an unresisting and unrejecting partner, the necrophiles frequently express more than one motive for their acts. Our data confirms Smith and Brown's observations that, quote, necrophilia may appear as the culmination of a pattern of multiple and increasingly perverse practices rather than an isolated, abrupt deviation, quote, quote. Do you agree with that?
Well, no, if it's, I understand where the author of that went wrong. Necrophilic behavior may occur on an occasional basis that way, just as erotic cannibalism may occur that way, but it doesn't make it necrophilia. If it's just something a person does when they've run out of other frontiers to cross after a variety of sex crimes, then it's not necrophilia. It's only necrophilia if it's an enduring desire.
Okay, but I just want to concentrate on this. Although the most common motive for necrophilia, according to the co-authors, was possession of an unresisting and unrejecting partner, the necrophiles frequently express more than one motive for their acts. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. How many necrophiles, homicidal necrophiles, have you dealt with in the course of your career?
Directly in, I'd say 3 or 4 cases, indirectly in 20 or 30, and by way of reading about them and studying them and assembling the literature, just about all that are known.
3 or 4 necrophilics you've had something to do with, that is where you clinically have sat down and talked to them. I think that's what you mean when you sit down with somebody who you're talking to, that's clinical, right?
Right, either that or where I've had occasion to really study every aspect of their life, as I have with Mr. Dahmer.
I understand, but I'm talking about in terms of cases where you came into court and rendered an opinion on the fact that a necrophile, a necrophiliac homicidal killer was or was not possessed of a mental disease. How many cases you testified to in?
I've only heard of one other case in my experience where anyone promoted an insanity defense for necrophilia. Usually no one would suggest it was insanity.
Well, well, we have some doctors here that say it was. So with all due respect, I want to know, did you testify in that case?
In any?
In that case you're talking about?
There's one case that I did, yes.
And was that an insanity defense?
It was an insanity defense based on a claim of holes in his brain, epilepsy, post-traumatic stress disorder, sexual torture in childhood, and manic depressive illness. Nobody suggested that necrophilia made him insane.
Okay, but my question is, was necrophilia the only mental aberration claimed in that case where you testified as to your opinion? It was more than necrophiliac. Epilepsy, you said, was involved.
Well, it wasn't involved, but the defense claimed it was.
Well, okay. Let's talk about our respective roles. It is your function in a courtroom to express your opinion, to assist the jury in making a decision, as you so have aptly said it, that it is going to be their decision whether or not there was mental disease, correct?
That's right.
That's your role.
Yes.
Just as it was the role of Dr. Fosdill, Dr. Friedman, Dr. Berlin, Dr. Becker, Dr. Wallstrom, and Dr. Palermo, correct?
Exactly.
It is not mine or the courts or anyone other than the juries.
Correct.
You are a noted, internationally noted and renowned forensic psychiatrist who has come into this courtroom, and on the basis of everything that you've learned and on all the basis of your clinical findings, you have opined, you have stated as your opinion as a forensic psychiatrist that Mr. Dahmer, when he committed these homicides, 13 anyway, was not suffering from a mental disease. Correct? According to Wisconsin law and the questions that you were asked, you stated that he was not suffering from a mental disease at the time that he committed the homicides in question.
Without endorsing the flattering aspects of the question about my reputation as to what I've testified about here,
sure.
I think that is correct. Okay. That I've expressed the opinion that at the time of at least the 13 homicides, the paraphilic aspects of Mr. Dahmer do not fulfill, in my opinion, the Wisconsin criteria for a mental disease. And even if they did, that he nonetheless appreciated the wrongfulness of his actions and could conform his conduct to the requirements of the law, regardless of whether one thinks that this is a mental disease.
Let's stop right there. Up until now, did you ever say that yesterday and up till this morning, that even if he was suffering from a mental disease, even if this is considered a mental disease, he would have been able to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct and conform his conduct to requirements of law? Have you said that before?
It's clear, the issue of mental disease was not what he was asked. Did he have a mental capacity? Every time that question was put, the record is very clear.
Mental disease issue was not in it. He was expressing a direct opinion on the capacity to appreciate wrongfulness and to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. The record is very clear as to that.
The record is clear that he was asked whether or not he was suffering from a mental disease under Wisconsin instruction. He said the instruction.
Said that this morning.
Okay, this one, I want to know.
Stated all of his opinions were
Okay,
directly.
gentlemen, I haven't asked for argument. I would like to perhaps hear the question read back so I fully understand the question.
Let's stop right there. Up until now, did you ever say that yesterday and up until this morning, that even if he was suffering from a mental disease, even if this is considered a mental disease, would have been able to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct and conform his conduct to the requirements of law?
I think the doctor's able to answer that question. Objections overruled. Go ahead, doctor.
I believe, first of all, that when I was asked all the specific questions about the responsibility prongs in connection with each of the killings, there was no mention made of mental disease, and I was expressing opinions about his appreciation of wrongfulness, regardless of whether there was a mental disease, and likewise for his conformity of conduct.
Okay, so let me ask, I'm sorry.
The only time in that process where I injected, to the surprise of Mr. McCann, some commentary about mental disease was on the last two charged killings.
Okay, let me ask you this question. Doctor, if he didn't have a mental disease, then he would always be able, we're here from an insanity case. If he didn't have a mental disease, he would be able, absolutely, to conform his conduct to requirements of law and to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct, correct? If he didn't have a mental disease, of course he would be able to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct and to conform his conduct to requirements of law. True?
Well, I don't know that perhaps, I haven't thought about it that way. There might be some kind of mental condition not recognized as a mental disease under Wisconsin law that medically could still impair him in those ways.
Did you make such a finding?
I haven't thought about this hypothetical, but I think that the general point is that of the mental diseases that anyone's considered in this case, if Mr. Dahmer doesn't have any of the conditions that someone might think is a mental disease, I'm sorry, I need to start again. If the jury were to find that Mr. Dahmer doesn't have a mental disease, then they would not be able to find him insane.
They wouldn't be able to say he couldn't conform, correct? That's the whole key. You first got to find the mental disease, correct?
The jury will have to do that, yes.
All right. But you were answering questions then about the fact over and over again that he was able to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct, and he was able to conform his conduct to requirements of law. And the reason he was able to do that is because you found that he wasn't suffering from a mental condition, the results of which was an impairment of his mind that was transitory or enduring that affected his mental or emotional processes, correct?
Not at all. No, the reasons for my saying that Mr. Dahmer appreciated the wrongfulness of his conduct are every one of those reasons that I gave for every one of the charged killings as evidence that showed that he knew that what he was doing was wrong. And the reasons for my opinions that he could conform his conduct to the requirements of the law are every piece of evidence I cited indicating that at the time of the killings with which he's charged, he could conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. If my reason were a personal belief that he didn't have a mental disease, there'd be no need to look at all that evidence. But the jury, like me, have to make up their minds based on the evidence about these crimes, not on a theory of mental disease.
But you know, Mr. McCann show you the jury instruction? Did you read the Wisconsin jury instruction?
Yes, I did.
Did you read what the jury by the court will be directed to do in their deliberations?
That they will first consider the question of mental disease, I believe.
Correct.
Yes,
They must find a mental disease first, correct?
that's my recollection.
Is a person who is suffering from a sexual disorder called a paraphilia, having recurrent intense sexual urges and sexually arousing fantasies for a period of 6 months involving either non-human objects, and that person has either acted on these urges or is markedly distressed by them. Do you agree that that is the definition of what a paraphilia is?
I agree that that's the DSM-3R description, and I've explained
You agree
what I
with
don't like about it.
Do you agree with it?
I think it's too narrow, but I agree that anyone who meets those criteria does have necrophilia.
So paraphilia.
Sorry, thank you.
Of all of the paraphilias, which paraphilia has inherent in it homicide?
None.
Except necrophilia, if the person kills to get the corpse, correct?
No. Sexual sadists are the ones who kill the most.
But inherent in the...
It's not inherent in any of them.
I thought he finished. I've been very... If I'm cutting you off, just let me know. I don't mean to do that. Go ahead. Finish your question.
Homicide is not inherent in any paraphilia, though there have been some who have questioned whether there may be a paraphilia of killing and have searched to find a case that might be an example of it. It's not anything that's yet been described.
Doesn't sexual sadism include the conscious torturing of another human being for one's own sexual purposes? Isn't that what it is?
Yes.
Person's got to be conscious.
The victim has to be, yes.
And isn't it suggested that perhaps the sexual sadist will end up killing the person, but it's not inherent in the concept of sexual sadism that the person ends up being deceased, correct?
Correct. Just as in necrophilia,
Sure.
It's not inherent that the person starts out being alive.
Next question. Sexual masochism is where a person can end up killing themselves because in the interest of what they're doing in their paraphilic disorder, they may end up not pulling the escape valve at the last moment, correct?
Yes.
Right. But in necrophilia, if the necrophiliac can't get his corpse, it very well may be that to achieve his fantasy, he may involve himself in homicide. True?
Unless he decides to masturbate, unless he decides to look at a picture of a dead body, unless he decides to get someone to pretend to be dead, or pay them to do that. One of the things he may choose to do is to kill.
Do you agree? And if I cut you off, just say you got more. Do you agree with the findings by Dr. Rossman and Dr. Resnick that the genuine necrophile has a persistent sexual attraction to corpses? The sexual attractions may be manifested in the necrophile's fantasies or in a series of necrophilic acts. Most of this group fits the DSM-3R diagnosis of paraphilia not otherwise specified and includes cases in which the corpse represents a fetishistic object we classify them as genuine necrophiles, A, necrophile homicidals, B, regular necrophilias, and C, necrophilic fantasies. And the fourth category is the pseudo-necrophile. Do you agree with that breakdown of necrophiles?
I'd want to look in more detail at just what they're doing.
It is a rare thing, is it not, in the history of mankind to find people who commit homicide to carry out their necrophilic acts. True? It's rare.
As far as we know, it used to be rare. It's becoming more common.
If I were to tell you that Dr. Rasmussen Resnick's study found as late as 1989 that there were only 14 in a study of a group representing 188 that is then knocked down to 54, there would be a rarity. There's only 54 genuine necrophilia cases that they found, that they studied, and 14 of those were homicidal necrophilics. That would be a small proportion of people on the cosmos, correct?
Well, that's only a small proportion has been written up in the journals. What they studied was cases other people had published, but most cases don't get published. I still agree with the idea that it is not common.
Sure.
And that, and of course, most necrophilic behavior and necrophilic crimes goes undetected. The people are never caught for it because the victims can't speak.
Let me ask you this. Would Jeffrey Dahmer had continued his necrophilic homicides had he not been arrested or because of the Tracy Edwards thing?
As long as he had a place that he could privately take them, alcohol to decrease his inhibitions, and could spare the time to dispose of the remains.
I want to ask you then about Mr. Dahmer's conduct. You have alluded to the fact that he had his own apartment as a thing that was something that you considered, so he could secret people away, correct?
Yes.
You indicated that he never did this in public. In other words, he never killed anybody at the peep shows. He never killed anybody on the streets. If he had done that, let's assume that he had done that, killed somebody in a peep show and had a necrophilic act with one person in that peep show, one time, would your answers as to his mental condition without the psychoses that we have generated in our litany, would your answers be any different as to his mental condition when he was killing all these other people?
Objections. Almost unintelligible questions.
Doctor, can you understand the question?
Yes.
Let me answer it. Good. I appreciate that.
I'd want to explore the behavior at the time of that homicide, just as I have for each of the others, assuming that there were no other differences in his behavior, but rather he was intoxicated when that happened, assuming that he escaped and realized he had a close call, leaving a corpse in there and people had seen him in the store, and that he didn't do it again. Assuming he said about that I realized I took too big a risk, and so I stopped doing it that way, I think I'd come to the same conclusions.
You know,
On the other hand,
go ahead.
if he dragged the corpse out in the store and told the manager, I think you better do something with this guy, and walked away, I'd have a different opinion, because that would suggest that maybe he didn't know it was wrong.
Well, how about conformity?
Well, if he had gone into a bookstore and spotted a male with an attractive physique, and there in front of the surveillance camera and the guy at the desk who's reading his newspaper, he strangles the man and gets down between the shelves of the store and has sex with the corpse on the floor while other patrons are in and out, I'd say that that implies that he's having difficulty conforming his conduct.
Because of what? Mental condition?
Well, it would only happen if he also had a mental disease.
Which would be something other than just pure paraphilic behavior.
Correct. Someone whose only problem is a paraphilia would not do that particular thing.
Before we break for, tell me if you want to go on. 2 things before we break for lunch. First of all, let's talk about serial killers, the ones that you've studied. Is it safe to say that most serial killers who were not psychotic, as we have now learned the litany of what that means, were antisocial?
That most of them were? Was that the question?
I forgot my question. Is it safe to say that the serial killers that you have studied who were not psychotic were antisocial?
Well, that's the most common personality disorder, but narcissistic personality disorder and other kinds of personality traits also occur. They aren't all antisocial.
Were all serial killers that you've studied, regardless of what their personality traits were, other than the psychotic ones, found by you to be antisocial?
Well, by definition, any serial killer who wasn't psychotic or mentally retarded, and none have been mentally retarded, would have at least the antisocial trait of failing to conform to the law.
There is in the DSM-3R something called antisocial behavior.
Adult antisocial behavior.
What's it called? Do you know what I'm talking about?
There's a non-diagnosis, a label called adult antisocial behavior.
Did all serial killers that you studied, would you have affixed that to them, adult antisocial behavior?
I would certainly say that every serial killer must either have antisocial personality disorder or some antisocial personality traits, or to have engaged in some antisocial behavior, I think by definition. I don't think there's ever been one who did it for pro-social purposes.
What did you state in your formal report, so I don't take up time looking for it because I can find it over the noon hour? What did you say relative to the finding of antisocial conduct on Mr. Dahmer, if you recall?
In my report, I stated that Mr. Dahmer had certain personality traits. And I specifically mentioned antisocial as one of the kinds.
Did you not state on page 6?
Thank you.
Second paragraph, well, first full paragraph. Mr. Dahmer, about the 4th sentence, does not meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder, and in particular lacks features of a conduct disorder before age 15.
That's
Did I
right.
read that right?
Yes, and that's
Is that true of other serial killers, also serial killers who were found to have been, the ones we're talking about, the big names, the Bundys, the Gacy's, the ones you've studied? Were these folks also did they not meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder, and in particular, they lack features of a conduct disorder before age 15?
That's been true for quite a few of them. Bundy was principally a necrophile who had adult antisocial behavior, but not much by way of the childhood stuff.
Did you put in your report that he had adult antisocial behavior?
I said he had antisocial traits.
Okay. But you didn't say adult. I'm just trying to use phrases. Adult antisocial behavior. You didn't say that.
No, that's a term to be used when there's nothing at all wrong with someone and you just want to describe why they came in.
Before we break for lunch, you indicated to me that if Jeffrey Dahmer had gone into the supermarket, had committed a necrophilic act, had killed somebody, had had sex with them, and had gone up to the manager and said, you better do something about what happened back there, you might reassess what you think about his mental condition, because that would have really been an overwhelming thing to have found in Jeffrey Dahmer that would have caused you maybe to give your hypothesis a second look, correct?
Well, I didn't say supermarket, but I'll accept that one too. If he'd done it in the supermarket, I'd feel the same way.
No.
That if he behaved in that manner, I would believe that there would have to be another mental disorder present.
And frankly, one of the things that you've told us and other doctors have told us is that this getting rid of the evidence, knowing to bring people back, doing it only on the weekends, hiding, escaping detection, all of that showed a fellow who was in control of his environment, and therefore, even though he didn't have a mental disease anyway, he was conforming his conduct to requirements of law. He was in control, correct? You've said that, haven't you?
I haven't said that he didn't have a mental disease. I have said that all of those behaviors you just alluded to indicate that Mr. Dahmer was aware of the wrongfulness of his conduct, appreciated that, and that the behaviors that I described show that he could conform his behavior to the requirements of the law.
Am I missing something here? Did Jeffrey Dahmer have a mental disease, in your professional opinion, at the time that he was carrying out these homicides, other than the last two?
I think that that's a jury question. Perhaps I'm permitted to express an opinion on it.
Well, let me ask you it this way. Was he suffering from an impairment of the mind that was either enduring or transitory, that affected his mental or emotional processes at the time he was committing these murders? An impairment of the mind.
Well, I think that a paraphilia is an abnormal condition of the mind, which is what I thought the law specified. I think that alcohol dependence is an abnormal condition of the mind. I don't think that personality disorder or personality traits necessarily meet that. And of those categories, which are the only ones I think apply to Mr. Dahmer, I don't think paraphilia or personality traits or disorders substantially affect mental or emotional processes for the reasons I gave. I think that alcohol dependence may substantially affect emotional processes.
That would only been for the last two killings, though.
Well, he's always been alcohol dependent, or at least since age 17. But the question of alcohol intoxication applies to the last two killings.
I'm of the opinion, Dr. Dietz, that Mr. McCann read to you, asked you if he sent you the jury instructions. Did you read the definition of mental disease? And I believe he repeated it. Mental disease is an abnormal condition of the mind which substantially affects the mental or emotional processes. And I believe he asked you whether or not Jeffrey Dahmer qualified for that condition on each and every time of these homicides. And I believe your answer was he did not have such an abnormal condition of the mind which substantially affected his mental or emotional processes.
I think you'll find your recollections incorrect. He asked me if Jeffrey Dahmer's paraphilias amounted to such a condition.
Then I'm going to ask you, did Jeffrey Dahmer, at the time he was committing these murders, have such an abnormal condition of his mind that his mental and emotional processes were substantially affected?
And my answer to that is that I don't know.
Okay.
Partly because it really is a jury question in the end. But my actual area of uncertainty here is what the effects are of alcohol intoxication at the time of the last two killings.
So what you're saying is you don't know, but it wouldn't matter because all of his conduct was such that he could have conformed it to the requirements of law. He didn't lack substantial capacity because of the things you enumerated, correct?
I think that that's what the evidence shows.
Right. Now I want to go back to the supermarket incident. There was a time, it wasn't a supermarket. There was a time, and the evidence shows, and you have told us about it, And if I'm wrong on any of my facts, please tell me before you answer that I'm wrong on any of my facts, and I'll try and correct them. That Mr. Dahmer had in his apartment Conrac synthamazone. I apologize that I don't pronounce that well because poor young man is deceased. But he had Conrac, and that's all I'm going to call him from now on. That he had drilled a hole in his head to try and make him into a zombie. That he left to go get some beer. That as he was returning, he saw this youngster on the street naked. That in spite of seeing him naked and in spite of seeing people around, this Laotian Asian boy, who it has been put into testimony was certainly in a minority of minorities, was disoriented, that Jeffrey Dahmer went up to him and put his arms around him, that he claimed that it was his friend, that people were viewing this and making noises and saying things, observing this conduct, that the police and the fire came onto the scene, that Jeffrey Dahmer convinced the policeman that this was his boyfriend and all of that, what that means, that the police asked him for identification and he gave his name and the place where he worked. He said this is his friend of 2 or 3 weeks duration. The officers went back to his apartment. He identified the youngster by the name of John Hamong. That there was a dead body on the bed in the next room. That at no time did he try and stop the police from coming into that apartment. That he said, I will take care of that youngster. And that when the police left, at some time within a short period thereafter, he attempted to continue making this youngster in a zombie state, having failed to do that and accomplished that on prior occasions and ended up with a dead body, that in fact that youngster died. Is that not akin to telling the fella at the supermarket stand, go on back because there's a body back there, maybe you ought to do something about it?
I think you could say that Mr. Dahmer has guts. He went through those elaborate procedures to con the police into thinking that there was not a problem here and got them to leave. It's in marked contrast to the hypothetical example of what became the supermarket, where the point was that a crime was committed right in the presence of others. Here, Mr. Dahmer committed his crime behind closed doors before the presence of others and after the presence of others. And during the presence of others, told an effective set of lies to cover himself. He didn't have very many logical options available to him here, because by this time, he had drilled a hole in the boy. If Dahmer had walked away at that point and let the police or the rescue people take him, they would have taken him to a hospital or tried to identify him. Someone may have discovered that he was delirious because of acid in his brain. They would have done some testing. They might have discovered what happened, or else he would have died and it would have been discovered then at an autopsy. And Mr. Dahmer had no way to know whether before dying, this young man might reveal his identity, or whether an investigation of the neighborhood where they picked him up might track back to him. Once he had him back in the apartment with the police gone, experiencing relief that he'd gotten rid of the police, now he really had to kill him. Though he may have liked to have preserved him as a zombie, he didn't see another option. He couldn't let him go, and he knew that the only way to prevent being tied to the death was going to be to dispose of these remains so that they couldn't be discovered, because the police could tie him to that particular young man.
Doctor, it's your belief that Jeffrey Dahmer thought those things that you've said, or are you hypothecating?
Well, his behavior is completely consistent with that.
Now, let me-
by which he did it.
Let me ask you this. You then are telling us that he knew he was going to have to kill him. He was going to have to kill him.
Well, he was going to have to kill him, and he would like to have been able to enjoy him some more.
Right.
And he never saw the killing as gratifying, but rather as a means to an end in each instance. And what he would have found more gratifying was to keep Conrack in a zombie-like state as long as possible.
One more question before we break.
Okay, this is the last one.
Doctor, when that youngster doesn't come back to his home and the parents go looking for him, would not Jeffrey Dahmer have known that 3 policemen saw that same youngster in his apartment? And wouldn't Jeffrey Dahmer have made a better choice by leaving him live in spite of the holes in the head than in killing him when 3 policemen knew the last place that child was seen was in his apartment? How about that choice?
Morally, of course, it would have been a better choice to let him live. As to evading detection, if he'd let him live, he was going to have a problem. That hole in the skull was not going to go away. The acid in the brain was not going to go away. Someone was going to find that there was a problem with this young man unless Jeffrey Dahmer dismembered the corpse and destroyed all the evidence.
We'll break for lunch. I'd like to try to get going at 1:15, so court's in recess.
All right.